Back when I was driving solo, I found myself in Memphis, Tennessee, waiting for a delivery to be unloaded. The receiver took his sweet time, 7 hours to be exact, leaving me stuck there long enough for my clock to run out. With no other option, I had to drive over to West Memphis and park at the TA Petro for my 10-hour reset. By the time I arrived, the lot was almost full, and the only spot left was the farthest, darkest corner. It wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd choose to park if you had a choice, but I didn't. I grabbed my dog, Noodles, and we headed out for a quick restroom break. As we walked, I noticed a man standing at the back of a trailer, just lingering there. Something about him made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was an unease to him. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what his deal was. I hurried Noodles, practically pulling him back to the truck, and once we were safely inside, I locked the doors. After a few minutes, I decided to head to the store and grab some dinner. I figured a good meal might settle my nerves. As I walked, I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. When I glanced back, my stomach dropped. It was the same man from the trailer. He was trailing behind me, keeping pace no matter how much I tried to lose him by taking different paths. My pulse quickened. I wasn't exactly scared yet, just unnerved. When I finally made it inside the store, the place was packed. People everywhere, the noise, the bustle. I thought I'd feel safer with the crowd around, so I snagged a seat at the bar before someone else could take it. I ordered my food and tried to relax, but halfway through my meal, nature called. I told the waitress I wasn't finished. I'd be back in a minute. But when I returned, something wasn't right. My fork, which I always placed on the left side of my plate because I'm left-handed, was now on the right. That uneasy feeling in my gut returned, but with vengeance. I looked around the room, scanning for the man who had followed me, but he was nowhere to be seen. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but everything in me was screaming that something had been done to my food. I flagged down the waitress, still standing behind my chair, and I asked if she'd messed with my food. She shook her head, confused, and when I asked if she saw anyone else touch it, she told me she was too busy to notice. My heart was racing as she went to get the manager. When he came over, I told him about the man who had been following me, how he disappeared when I walked inside, and now this strange switch with my utensils. The manager's face grew serious. He offered me a new meal and moved me to a seat closer to the office. Then he excused himself, saying he needed to check something. A few minutes later, he returned, sat down across from me, his expression grave as he spoke. I looked through the camera feed, he said, and a man did approach your plate while you were gone. He put something in your mashed potatoes, stirred it, and then left the building. Unfortunately, we don't have cameras in the truck lot, so I have no idea where he went after that. I don't want you to leave the store alone, and I need to report this to the police. Do you mind if I call them? I nodded, still trying to process what he had just told me. Go ahead, I said, my voice, I'm sure, a little shaky. The manager went ahead and called the police, and I stayed put, finishing up my meal while keeping an eye on the door. A few minutes later, he brought me a piece of pie on the house, which was a small comfort and delicious. When the police arrived, they took my statement and searched the grounds for the man, but they couldn't find him. After a couple of hours, one of the officers offered to drive me back to my truck. As we had walked out, he told me he was going to ask his boss if they could station an officer near my truck for the night. Sure enough, they got permission. And that entire night, the police car parked in that dark corner of the lot, keeping watch. The man was never caught, and I never found out what he put in my food, but nothing bad happened to me or anyone else that night. To this day, I'm still thankful for those officers who went out of their way to make sure I was safe. I was driving through the Texas Panhandle, heading north into Oklahoma. I was third in line on a 2-lane road, following a cattle hauler. The wind was fierce, a strong headwind that made it impossible to shift into top gear. It must have been the same for the other 2 drivers ahead of me, because I had no trouble keeping up with them. As we entered a curve, I saw the cattle truck ahead catch its right front tire on the berm of the road. The driver tried to recover, but the combination of oversteering, the relentless wind, and the cattle shifting to one side sealed his fate. With his overcorrection, he caught the berm of his left tire. Then he jerked the wheel back to the right. At that point, my view was blocked by the truck in front of me and the curvature of the road. Suddenly, the CB crackled to life. Shit, he's going over, man. The cattle hauler came back into view, but it was leaning dangerously to the left. None of the wheels on the driver's side were touching the ground. The truck teetered for a moment before tipping completely over on the passenger side, skidding to a halt in the gully alongside the road. I don't think either of our trucks had fully stopped before the driver in front of me and I sprinted out of the cabs, running towards the overturned cattle truck. The first thing I noticed were that 2 or 3 cows had been ejected through the aluminum roof. They were either dead or in the process of dying, their bodies scattered across the road. My main concern was the driver of the cattle truck. The other driver and I exchanged a glance, silently asking, "How are we going to climb up there?" Just then, the driver's side door creaked open, and the driver began to climb out, disoriented but alive. We scrambled to help him down. As much as I didn't want to, I had to look inside the trailer. The scene was worse than I'd imagined. Several of the cattle were already dead. Others were barely clinging to life, and the rest bellowing in terror. The smell of blood and fear was overwhelming, and there was nothing I could do for them. This was the mid-90s, long before everyone had cell phones. The driver of the second truck offered to run for help while I stayed behind with the cattle truck driver, who was on the verge of shock. I helped him to my truck, where we waited for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, help arrived in record time. A deputy soon showed up and took my statement. He was polite but firm when he asked me to leave. Before I left, I asked him what would happen to the surviving cattle. He patted his gun, and the realization hit me hard. I wish I hadn't asked. As I climbed back into my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something that I'd carry with me for a long time.